I want to start with a quote from George Washington. George Washington he gave what's called his farewell address. It's considered to be the most significant political speech ever delivered in the history of the United States. In it, he gave about a dozen warnings designed to keep us on track. And in one part of his speech, he talks about political prosperity. And that's something we wish we had today. We don't seem to have it. We have a lot of polarization, but not what we would call political prosperity. But he said of all the habits and dispositions that lead to political prosperity, in other words, if you want political prosperity, he said religion and morality are indispensable supports. So if you want your politics to prosper, you don't separate religion and morality from politics. We've been doing that as a church for about 60 years. It goes back to the 1960s, a lot of movements there. We'll talk about some of that later. But he gives a really stern statement at the end of this. He said, "In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars." So anyone who tries to take religion and morality out of public life, don't call yourself a patriot. Now, he knew patriots. He had them at Valley Forge. He had them throughout the War for Independence. He said, if you try to separate religion and morality from politics, you can't call yourself a patriot. Now, we specifically saw this happen in the 1960s with the Supreme Court. The first indication of this was 1947, a case called Everson Birch Board of Education, where the Supreme Court kind of fired a shot over the bow and said, hey, we're not sure about this religion public stuff anymore. We might have to get away from that. The first time they did was in June of 1963 in a case called Engel versus Vitale. At that point in time, they said, you know, we think it's time to have prayer out of schools. And they said, we don't even care if it's voluntary prayer. Even if it's voluntary, even if you just do it because you want to, that's not constitutional anymore. The very next year, 12 months later, in two more decisions, Abbott and Shemp and Murray Curlett, they said, and this deal about reading the Bible in school, that has to come to a stop. So it's interesting that in that decision, in that 12 months, those three decisions, the court itself said, they said that taking prayer and Bible out of schools was without historical or legal precedent. Wait a minute. Did you just tell me that taking prayer and the Bible out of schools has no historical or legal basis? Then why did you do it? Well, this began the era of judicial activism that most of us have lived under our adult lives. We saw it go into things with life, the abortion, overturned the law of Texas, Roe v. Wade. We saw it go into marriage. We'll redefine marriage and the family. So that's a period of judicial activism. And it started, and it is significant. They said it doesn't have historical or legal basis. And yet today we're told, no, the reason we can't have the Bible in schools is the Founding Fathers didn't want it. Let me take you to a Founding Father. His name is Benjamin Rush. John Adams said of all the 250 Founding Fathers, he said he's one of the three most notable. He said you have George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush is called the father of public schools under the Constitution. A lot of other stuff he did. He started the first Bible Society in America. Matt was just up here telling you about American Journey Experience. We have a booth back around the corner. We have Benjamin Rush's Bible there, as well as several other signers. Matt mentioned we got about 50 items there. Benjamin Rush's Bible's back there. Benjamin Rush, called the father of public schools under the Constitution. Significantly, Benjamin Rush wrote this piece, given a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of public schools in America. Now, this is not something most of us have heard. We told Founding Fathers were atheists, agnostics, theists. They didn't want this. We shouldn't be involved in that. No, here is an evangelical Christian saying, guys, here's a dozen reasons we'll never take the Bible out of schools in America. And this is one of the statements he made about it. He says, the great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effectual means of extinguishing Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind that it was improper to read the Bible at schools. Now, we've had a whole lot of people persuaded that it's improper to read the Bible at schools. Even Christians say, no, if you want religion schools, have a Christian school, have a charter school, homeschool, but public schools shouldn't have religion. We've been persuaded that we shouldn't be reading the Bible in schools. Significantly, there's a Supreme Court decision from 1844. It's called Vidal versus Girard's Executors. It dealt with the situation in Philadelphia where there was a school in Philadelphia, government-run, government-operated, said, we don't think we're going to do this Bible in schools anymore. That's back in 1844. The case made the U.S. Supreme Court, and in an 8-0 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said, wait a minute, if you're a government-funded, government-operated school, you will teach the Bible in schools. We're not going to have a government school that won't teach the Bible. Now, this is not the kind of history we grew up hearing. We've heard exactly the opposite. See, this is why history is so significant. It's an anchor that keeps you on track. This is why Josiah, even in the revival he had where he's rebuilding the temple, was doing really good stuff until he found the scroll. And they said, we used to be like that? and then it changed the whole direction of the nation to go back and see where they had been. This is why history's been under attack for really about 60 years, revisionism, et cetera. So what you have with Benjamin Rush, he warned one of the results of taking the Bible out of school. He said that the Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. Now, as it turns out, we can prove that statistically. There's a lot of studies of psychologists and others, George Barton, the work he does, a lot shows that. And let me go even something that's been happening recently. The American Bible Society, this is a society started in 1816 by our founding fathers. It's the world's largest Bible society. They give out 250 million Bibles a year. It was started by signers of the Constitution. It was started by vice president. It was started by Supreme Court justices, by governors. That's a Bible society that started by our atheist founding fathers, by the way. That's what we hear. So they start the American Bible Society. It still exists today. And every year they do a report on the state of the Bible for that year. So 2 years ago, they did the report for 2022, which is looking at 2021. And in 2021, they document that there was a real downturn in Bible reading. You see it on the chart here. What they documented is that America lost 25 million Americans who no longer read the Bible at all. They don't even crack the book once a year. So we lost 25 million. Then about 4 weeks ago, the report came out for last year. And so the 2023 report, looking at 22, documented the same kind of downturn, that we've had a downturn, and we lost another 3 million last year. So literally in the last 2 years, we've lost 28 million Americans who no longer even crack the Word of God to see what's in it. Now the problem is, if you want political prosperity, you have to have religion and morality. And so we've come to a period of biblical illiteracy, and that period, this is the highest biblical literacy we've had in America. I'll show you some more stats in a little bit, but we don't know the Word of God very well at all. And as a result, what's happened is that desire that we have for political prosperity, it's rooted in religion and morality, and you don't have religion and morality without God's Word, so our politics is getting worse. And we're doing more and more trying to fix that, and you're not going to fix it until you get religion and morality back at the basis of what we do. I want to show you the difference between this generation and previous generations, even on how we looked at the issue of religion and politics. I want to take you back to a former president, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, this is what he said. Now, this is only 2 generations ago. We're still talking World War II type stuff. We got people alive today from World War II, a lot of vets from World War II. And look at what he was saying to that generation back then. He says, in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised on the fathers of the nation was conspicuously evident. He said, guys, there's no way you can look back at our history and not see the influence the Bible had in shaping America. You can today. You can go to virtually any school today, including Christian schools, and not see the influence of the Bible in America. Now, what in the world would he be talking about? Well, let me give you one example. If you take the document we have, the Constitution that we have, that Constitution is an old document as far as governments go. Cornell University Law School said, what's the average length of a constitution history of the world? We've had thousands of years of history, 5,800 years of history. We've had thousands of nations, hundreds of constitutions, and they found out the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. This last September the 17th, we celebrated 235 years. Nobody's come ever close to what America has done. And so the question is, where did America get the ideas that we have in that Constitution? What's the source of the ideas? And so they thought that's a good idea. And so political science professors at the University of Houston, in a study published by Louisiana State University Press, they went back and said, all right, the ideas we have in that document, where they come from? And the report is called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. What they did, they said, we think if we can go back and look at the writings of those who did the documents and see what they quoted in their writings, we'll know where they got their ideas. Brilliant, brilliant idea. They went back and took 15,000 writings out of the founding era. They found in those writings 3,154 direct quotes. They said, we're going to take every quote back to its origin. It took them 10 years to do so. At the end of 10 years, they came out with a report, and they said, here's what we found. The single most cited individual in the American founding when we create our documents is Baron Charles Montesquieu. He's a Christian philosopher from France. He wrote a two-volume set of books in 1750 called The Spirit of the Laws. It's a lot of where we see separation of powers come through and checks and balances. The second most cited individual was William Blackstone. He's a judge. He wrote a 4-volume set called Commentaries on the Laws. It was so popular in America, Thomas Jefferson said Americans read Blackstone's commentaries just like Muslims read the Quran. So we stayed a lot of time in those books, and they were quoted very often in the American founding. The third most cited individual was John Locke. John Locke wrote the 2 treatises of government. He's especially cited when we're writing the Declaration of Independence. Talk about him a little later. So these are the 3 most cited individuals. However, the single most cited source was the Bible. 34% of all quotes came out of the Bible. So we quoted the Bible 12 times more often than we quoted Blackstone or Montesquieu. Actually, 4 times more often than them, 12 times more often than Locke. Yeah, the Bible, hands down, is the #1 source of the ideas we had in the founding era. Now, so going back to Franklin Roosevelt, when he says, in the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised on the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. It is if you actually look at history instead of revised history. He continued. He says, we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. Really? Now, may I point out, this is a liberal, progressive Democrat saying this. We might have had political differences, but nobody disagreed on the influence of the Bible on the Founding Fathers and on building America. We all disagree today. There's a ton of Christians who disagree with what I've got more Christian enemies than I have secular enemies because of what I'm telling you right now. So we're a divided church today in many areas, and it's interesting. How can you prove what he's saying is right? Well, there's a lot of ways. For example, in the Constitution, we have what are called the due process clauses, the 4th through the 8th Amendment. There's 7 or 8 rights that we have in there: the right to confront your accuser, the right to trial by jury, the right to testify in your own defense, all these different rights that we have. And it's interesting that if you look at Federal Practice and Procedure, which is it's a multi-volume set that goes from here to the wall on how to practice federal law. In volume 30, it talks about the due process clauses. And in the Federal Practice and Procedure to this day, it points out that the reason you have the right to confront your accuser is John 8:10. The reason you have the right to compel witnesses in your behalf is Proverbs 17:17. The reason you get to testify in your own defense is Acts 22:1. Most Christians today have no clue what those verses are, but we were biblically literate and we knew how to apply the Bible to every aspect of life. Another president that I would point you to is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt said this. He says, the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and so entwined with our civic and social life. Notice he did not say spiritual life. That was a given. He said the Bible is so much a part of our civic and social life, it would be impossible for us to figure what life would be if these teachings were removed. What's he mean as part of our civic and social life? Well, if you study history, there are various types of economic systems. The economic system used in the United States was introduced in 1627 by the Pilgrims. It's what we call the free market, free enterprise system. You'll find from the writings of the Pilgrims, Governor William Bradford, that what we call the free market system, the most prosperous economic system in the history of the world, was built on 5 Bible verses, because back then, everyone who came to America was a socialist, because they all had kings. You worked your tail off for the king, you gave the king everything, he would give you back what he thought you needed, but it was all the kings. You didn't have the private property kind of stuff we're used to today. And they found 5 Bible verses: 1 Timothy 5:8, they found 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Matthew 25, Luke 19, and Matthew 20, and on that built what we call the free market system. The first free market business in the world was 1627 at Pawtucket, Massachusetts. So the Bible applies to economics? Absolutely. The Bible talks about estate taxes, inherited taxes, talks about minimum wage, and talks about capital gains taxes, progressive tax. All sorts of stuff in the Bible in economics, except we just look at spiritual stuff. They looked at the Bible for a guidebook of life. On top of that, if you look at the form of government we have, the Bible shows 7 different forms of government. We chose the one called a Republican form of government. Our founding fathers said a democracy is the worst form of government available, and a Republican is the best form, and that was based on Exodus 18:21, Deuteronomy 1:15 and 16, Deuteronomy 16:18. These aren't verses we talk about much anymore. These are the verses that were talked about in previous generations because it helped build the culture and shape the culture. So Ulysses S. Grant was president on the 100th anniversary of America. He came out with this card. Now, if you see on the top left, it's 1776, top right, 1876, and it says Centennial, 100-year celebration. He has a message to the children and youth of the United States. What is the President of the United States going to tell all the kids in America on our 100th birthday? This is what he told them. He said, hold fast to the Bible as a sheet anchor of your liberties. Write its precepts in your heart and practice them in your lives. He said, to the influence of this book, we're indebted for all the progress made in true civilization, and to this we must look as our guide in the future. Righteousness exalts a nation, sins are reproach any people. That is the President's message to the kids of America. We don't get that message in a lot of churches to the kids of America. And that's the presence. See, this is how much we've shifted, but we're not aware of it because we don't know our history. So when you look at what's back there, it's significant that what we have today is we really are suffering from biblical literacy. Currently, Barton shows that only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. And only 6% of Christians have a biblical worldview. In other words, only 1 in 16 Christians can take a Bible verse and apply it to due process, or to economics, or to education, or to immigration, or whatever. That's a biblical worldview. How does the Bible affect everything in life? And so that's a number that's a lot lower, and it's significant that with that number, oh, there it is, I had the numbers reversed, sorry. We've come to a point of biblical literacy which has affected the way that we see God's institutions. Now, we generally recognize there are 3 institutions granted by God. The first is that of the family. Genesis 1, 2, 3, God made man, made woman, they had children. God blessed the family, that's his institution. The second institution is that of government. In Genesis 9, Noah gets off the ark, and God says, here's the Noahide laws. Here's what you do to murderers, and et cetera. So God gave the first civil laws. When Moses goes to the mountain, not only did he give the 10 commandments, God gave them 613 laws. It dealt with economics, dealt with immigration, with criminal justice, with military. God gave them everything they needed to become a nation of slaves, to becoming the greatest nation in the old world, because he gave them a code of laws that dealt with civil government. We also have the third institution, which is that of the church, and we know that that's God's institution. Have the New Testament. We have the Old Testament type and shadows. Back in Exodus, he says, I want a tabernacle, I want my people gathering and assembling, I want congregations. So those are all 3 God's institutions. It's interesting that Christians today know more about family and church than they do about government. We don't really think of that as God's institution. But if you go to John Locke, when you look at John Locke, he's the guy that mentioned third most cited individual. John Locke wrote the 2 treatises of government, and this is what the signers of the Declaration said they, quote, copied the Declaration from Locke's 2 treatises. Locke's 2 treatises, written in 1690, talks about the proper use of civil government. He cites the Bible more than 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. Now, if most of us were called upon to list verses out of the Bible that address civil government, we might come up with 5, 8, 10, 1,500? See, this is what we studied back in the day, and so we had a much more biblical worldview on so much that went on. And so today, where we don't emphasize government as much, we do family and church, we've really kind of become 2/3 Christians. We need to become 3/3 Christians. We need to get back in all 3 of God's institutions because they're all his. He ordained them all. They came from him. Now, so the question becomes, okay, what do we do now? Well, I want to give you some specific things that we can do, because if you go back to when the Supreme Court said no more prayer, no more Bible in schools, you know, Kelly was here earlier, Kelly and Rick and Chad, and they deal in the civil arena very often. Kelly deals with so many Supreme Court cases, and it's interesting, the Supreme Court back then in '62 said the First Amendment, nah, we're really not going to do that anymore. And this is where they came out in 1971 with what was called the Lemon Test. Lemon v. Kurtzman, 1971, the court said, you know, here's the new standard for knowing whether a religious activity is constitutional. And so the Lemon Test says that a religious activity is constitutional if the primary purpose of that religious activity is secular. That's a 100% loser. There is no religious activity we engage in whose primary purpose is secular. Not prayer, not nativity scenes, not anything. That's where we've lost all these cases for all these years. But now we have a Supreme Court that has started reading the Constitution again every once in a while. And as they have, they've come up with different decisions. You see, we're used to winning. I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. They've all dealt with religious liberties. We're used to winning 1 case every 5 to 8 years. In the last 4 years, we've won 11 cases at the Supreme Court. This is why Kelly mentioned that if you're alive today, you have more religious liberty today than you've had in your entire lifetime, except we haven't heard much about those decisions. So let me kind of update you on them. When you look at what's happened, this started changing 4 years ago with what was called the Bladensburg decision. This is a cross, is a World War I memorial cross erected after World War I. 15 guys from the county were killed. The mothers wanted to put this cross up. And so as it worked its way, it was challenged, and it worked its way through court, and the case was called American Legion versus American Humanists. Humanists said, you can't have a cross up. Well, the lower court said, you know, we've got the Lemon Test, and the Lemon Test says you can't do this because the primary purpose of that cross is not secular. If you want to honor people that have died, you could have a pyramid or an orb or an obelisk. You don't have to have a cross. The Fourth Circuit actually said what you ought to do is knock the arms off the cross so it's just a straight pole, and then it'd be constitutional. the court said, we don't think the Founding Fathers were interested in taking down war memorials. We don't think that's what the Constitution is about. And so at that point in time, they came up with a new standard that says longstanding religiously expressive monuments, symbols, and practices require a strong presumption of constitutionality. If it's been here for a while and we've been doing it for a while, we're going to assume that that's what's constitutional, not what the court said in 73 or in 71. And so this is what has started something new. Now, what happened after that was 4 years later. We had a case last year that was out of Boston. And that case in Boston, the Shurtleff case, Boston would allow any kind of group to put their flag up they wanted to. One of the flagpoles is dedicated for anything. You see LGBTQ up there? Well, a Christian group said, we want to fly a Christian flag. They said, you can't fly a Christian flag. The primary purpose of a Christian flag is not secular. So they were told no, and amazingly, in a 9-0 unanimous decision, Supreme Court, including the liberals, they said, no, you can't cut Christianity out of public life. We've been told for years that we have to cut it out of public life. The liberals on the Supreme Court right now are more conservative than the liberals that were on the Supreme Court 50 years ago. It was a 9-0 decision, and that's the same year in which you got the Bremerton decision, Kennedy-Bremerton. This is the one Kelly mentioned this morning. This is where the court said, we've been using this Lemon test for a long time, and it's wrong, and all the cases decided by Lemon were wrongly decided. 7,300 cases, the court says we got it wrong 7,300 times. Virtually everything we know on public religious expression has now been turned on its head. Now, with that, we're back to the standard of longstanding. If it's been a traditional thing in America, we're going to assume it's constitutional. So, with that new standard, again, what do we do now? What do we do now? I want to take you to a Bible verse, Proverbs 21:22. Proverbs 21:22 says, a wise man attacks the city of the mighty and tears down the stronghold in which he trusts. So a wise man attacks the strongholds. Or, if you remember the great movie Princess Bride, Billy Crystal, have fun storming the castle. That's what a wise man does, is he storms the castle. He attacks the strongholds. He goes right at the strongholds. So instead of being defensive or waiting to see what happens, we start attacking. We have to go on the offense. And so that's part of what you see in that Bible verse is storm the castle or attack the strongholds. Now, how do you do that? Again, going back to what the court has done in the last 4 years, the court has said, hey, all those previous precedents, 7,300 cases, off the table. You know what that involves? It involves things like the 10 Commandments. And so the 10 Commandments, let's start putting up 10 Commandment reminders again. As a matter of fact, we have a legislative network at Wall Builders. We have about 1,000 Christian legislators all across the nation, conservatives, very active. And this year, Texas was in the midst of passing a law to put the 10 Commandments back in every single classroom in the state of Texas. And now, just yesterday, we were contacted by another 5 states who say, we want to do that in our schools too. Why can't we do that? Because the court since the 60s has told us we can't, but the court since the last 4 years has said, that's fine, because all those things are taking it out. Do you know when the Supreme Court ruled that we could not have the 10 Commandments in a classroom, there were more than 52 depictions of the Supreme Court, depictions of the 10 Commandments in the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court chamber, there's more than 50 depictions of the 10 Commandments. So you're telling me we can't see what's sitting in your chamber more than 50 times? Most folks have no clue the U.S. Supreme Court has more than 50 depictions of the 10 Commandments. So let's start putting the 10 Commandments back up. Let's put it up at city halls. Did you know that in the 1940s, more than 10,000 classrooms had the 10 Commandments posted? And there were 180 monuments to 10 Commandments at city halls and at state capitals. Go back to doing that. Let's put 10 Commandments back up. In the same way, in addition to putting 10 Commandments up, think about memorial crosses, because we were told these had to come down because there's no secular purpose for. So now if you have a police officer killed or a highway patrolman killed, let's erect a memorial cross to those guys, because that's what we used to have alongside the highways, was state erected memorial crosses for these people who lost their lives. In the same way, when you look at public invocations, we're back to pray. We can pray again now. It's okay to pray publicly now. So let's start public meetings with prayer. Let's start every city council meeting with prayer. Let's start school board meetings with prayer. Let's get everything going back to prayer. And specifically, when you look at what is happening in the last 3 years on school boards, Churches have finally decided to get involved in school boards. There's a church in Fort Worth won 20 out of 21 seats in Fort Worth School Board. In Dallas, 51 churches came together, won 15 out of 15 school board seats in Dallas. Church in Houston came together, won the school board seats. In Colorado, they won 78 school boards, including the 1,500 churches got together. They won 78 school boards, including the Denver School Board and all 4 school boards in Colorado Springs, happening across the nation. Now that we get them, let's start having prayer at school board meetings again. Let's start asking for God's help again. Nativity scenes, Christmas is a federal holiday to celebrate the birthday of Jesus Christ. It's not a winter holiday celebration. It is called Christmas, and it's not about Santa Claus and Rudolph. But we have been told that you can't have nativity scenes unless you have a lot of reindeer out there, unless Santa's there, and unless you get all the secular stuff. We've been told that for about 25 years. That's off the table now. This reverse. Same with all these. We had all these Christmas programs with kids, and now they're called winter programs. Let's go back to having Christmas programs. And by the way, you can also sing Christmas carols. You don't just have to sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Here Comes Santa Claus. We're back to singing actual Christmas hymns. This is all back on the table if we'll get aggressive and do something with this. In the same way, in God We Trust this place, we ought to be putting the national motto up everywhere we can paint it. It ought to be This is from Arkansas. Arkansas requires every school, every classroom in Arkansas to display a big "In God We Trust" poster in Arkansas. See, Romans 1 tells us that if you're God conscious, your behavior is different. When you forget about God, you change your behavior and it goes the wrong direction. So this is all good stuff for the country. You can do the same thing with student-led prayer. It's okay to have prayer in schools if students lead it. So encourage your students in your church, encourage your youth group to ask for prayer at schools and start leading prayer at schools. As a matter of fact, we haven't been able to have prayer at graduations for about 20 years. And we used to do baccalaureate at churches before the graduations. Go back to doing that. This is all back on the table. This was taken out in the last 20 years when the court was saying, oh, you have to be secular. We don't have to be secular. And Bible courses for credit. Do you know that right now there are 1,200 school districts in the United States teaching the Bible as a credit course? More than 200,000 students are engaged in that. Just talked to a group of pastors, called them on the phone, and they were telling me that in Minnesota, they have started a course for credit in Minnesota public schools in their district, and it's on the influence of the Bible in the American founding. And it's a credit course because it's an academic study. You're simply looking at history. All this stuff can be done. One more example, as we've been told, you couldn't talk about creation. You have to leave that out. It has to be evolution, not anymore. If there's a basis for it, you can't delete it just because it happens to be religious. All of these things are out there, but none of them are going to happen unless we push on them. Because the secular people are really comfortable with what's there. This is where we have, you know what? When you try to do this, you're going to end up in a lawsuit. Good for you, because we've got all these groups waiting to take these lawsuits. The court. The courts have already made it clear we're going to win these lawsuits. Somebody's just got to take it to court. Otherwise, we're going to keep living under the fiction of the law that says you have to be secular. And that's just not the case. So we really need to get back on top of these aspects. And so those 7,300 cases need to go. Another thing that's really sweeping the nation right now, it's a group, and it's just outside on the right, first booth down on the right. It's United Truth Fellowship. And what they've been able to do is get the Ministerial Association and others, get these guys to agree that, in our church, once a quarter, we're going to preach a sermon that specifically addresses current events. We'll take something out of the newspaper, something that's going on in the schools, and we're going to preach a sermon to show our people that the Word of God applies to every aspect of life. And that's a big deal, because now we're getting back to, as you heard Matt earlier talk about, Paul Revere's riding to the home of Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark is the guy who got the Lexington Minutemen going, and when the British left from Lexington and went to Concord, it was the Reverend William Emerson who had 400 guys at his church out there. And then when the British turned around and marched back to Charleston, a 16-mile march, 4,500 Americans were lined up along the way, and it was all sorts of churches. Benjamin Balch had his church out there. Payson Phillips had his church out there. It was churches that built America, and we were involved in all of those arenas. And so this is something that we can get back involved with again. So if you want to just go by that booth, they will give you Wayne Grudem's book on politics, and Bible and politics. They give you Jim Garlow's book on Well-Versed, all the biblical basis for the stuff we're talking about. So finishing up, I want to close with this challenge from Matthias Burnett. He was a famous preacher in the American founding, really strong preacher for many of the founding fathers. And this is what he said. He said, to God and posterity, you're accountable for your rights and your rulers. Someday you'll stand in front of God, and he's going to say, what'd you do with the life I gave you? We'll have to account. What'd you do with the family I gave you? We'll account. What'd you do with the church I gave you? We'll account. What'd you do with that country I gave you? Oh, decided not to get involved in that one. That's not going to be a good time in front of God when he asks for stewardship of the country he gave us. And this is what he said. He said, let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers delivered to you. See, we have a stewardship, and that's what we need to be as good stewards. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share.